Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Thomson Reuters, The Answer Company. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center and Medi-Spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. The Minnesota Twins are looking forward to another great season in 2023, led by the return of All-Stars Carlos Correa and Brian Buxton. With the return of numerous players who were injured in 2022 and some new acquisitions, another division crown and a return to the World Series are in their sights. Established in 2007, 45th Parallel Spirits was among the first 50 micro-distilleries in the United States. Based in New Richmond, Wisconsin, all aspects of production occur at our facility. If you're interested in visiting and learning more about the 45th Parallel Distillery, please check our website and plan a visit to tour our facility and taste our spirits. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Access to Democracy. I'm your host, Steve Francisco. It's my pleasure to welcome to our studio today a first-time guest, Sami Rahamim, who is the Communications and Community Affairs Director, that's a mouthful, for the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. Sami, welcome to Access to Democracy.
Thank you, Steve.
So as you know, we've had your colleagues, Steve Hunnigs has been a guest on our program numerous times, and Ethan Roberts, a friend of mine, has been on the show even recently a few months ago. We wanted you to come in and appreciate your coming in today to discuss the tragic events that are unfolding in Israel and really throughout the region right now. Just to recap for our visitors, October 7th, the Hamas terrorist group launched terrorist attacks on Israel. More than 1,400 Israelis killed, thousands more injured, hundreds of Israelis, and including Americans, taken hostage. I understand the highest number of Jewish deaths in one day since the Holocaust of World War II. And also we have to mention over 3,400 Palestinians in Gaza killed, 1,000 more injured. I understand that you've traveled and studied extensively in Israel, and I have to ask you, do you have family there right now? How are they doing? How are your friends doing? What are you hearing from them?
Thank you, Steve. The terror attacks almost 2 weeks ago in Israel impact every Israeli. It's a small country, under 10 million population, and when you have a scale of an attack like what we saw on October 7th, virtually everyone in the country knows someone or is only 1 degree away from a person who was killed, injured, and now especially called up for reserve duty in the military. My family lives mostly in the center region of Israel, in Tel Aviv and the surrounding towns.
Which is the largest city in Israel. Yes.
Yeah, the main metropolis area. And the attacks on the 7th, Hamas terrorists infiltrated into Israel and were mostly engaged in killing civilians in a range of about a few kilometers from the Gaza Strip. But they launched rockets into the civilian population centers of Israel. So my family has been spending, like many Israelis, now several days in they call the safe room in each apartment building is built with a reinforced room that acts as a bomb shelter when the code red rocket alarm blares. And so you have my relatives, families of 4 and 5, 6, all sleeping in these safe rooms for days on end, and it's extremely distressing at the same time that they're in an active process of mourning and shock at these unbelievable numbers of innocent civilians, women, children, elderly, killed in their homes, something that just is really challenging to wrap one's mind around.
So I want to ask you, Sami, how would you characterize or describe the reaction, particularly of Jewish Minnesotans, to this tragedy that is occurring and the attacks in Israel? How would you characterize the reaction?
So I have this family connection to Israel, but that's not necessarily unique to Jewish Minnesotans. It's very common for Jewish people to have close family, friend connections in Israel, and so this is personal for us. And these have been 2 weeks of extreme sadness, pain at the horrific attacks that took place, and we also know that when there's conflict in Israel, data shows us that violence and threats against Jewish people worldwide increases. And so there's been considerable concern about the safety of the Jewish community here in Minnesota as well. And so that is part of this terror campaign, is to not only physically harm the Israelis over there, but to inflict a psychological damage and to cause fear in Jewish people in particular around the world.
We need to mention that it was reported that this story, as you say, it reverberates around the world, including right here at home in Minnesota. A former St. Paul teacher, correct me if I'm mispronouncing his name, Noy Maudi, aged 29 years old, was killed. He was one of the young people attending the concert that occurred in southern Israel when Hamas launched their attack. And I believe the news reports are that the highest single number of deaths in any one place occurred at that concert on October 7th. Are you aware, are there other Minnesotans that your organization is aware of who are missing, who may have been kidnapped?
Minnesotans kidnapped, I'm not aware of any, but there are other connections between Minnesotans, current or former, people who have lived here, and individuals who have been kidnapped and murdered in these attacks. Yes, there are several, and Noy, the teacher, is one. There was a camper who had been at the Herzl camp over in western Wisconsin, which many in our community attend, where I attended, was killed in the attacks as well. And yeah, it reverberates very close to home on many levels.
So President Biden spoke to the nation last night, only his second address from the Oval Office, and I assume that you heard what the president said last night. What was your reaction to the president's speech, where he laid down very strong U.S. support for Israel in its war with Hamas? He has already dispatched 2 aircraft carriers, the Eisenhower and the Gerald Ford, along with other ships, and we also have ships in the Red Sea, which apparently took down a couple of missiles that they believe were fired by Houthi rebels in Yemen. What is your reaction to the way the administration is handling this attack on Israel and the situation in the region?
I think President Biden has shown tremendous American leadership at a moment when it's been absolutely needed. And we feel that as the American Jewish community. Israelis are feeling that, and supremely grateful to President Biden and his leadership, naming in remarkably clear terms the genocidal threat that Hamas poses to Israel. And what I particularly appreciated about the speech last night was drawing this connection between the struggle in Ukraine and Israel's struggle, right? These are two democracies that have a neighboring entity that are committed to its destruction, right? Exactly as President Biden said. Russia, Vladimir Putin openly talks about how Ukraine...
Wiping out Ukraine.
Yeah, he doesn't think it should exist.
Saying it never did exist, which is an interesting thing to say since Russia previously acknowledged that Ukraine did exist as a political entity.
It's
very strange.
It's ahistorical for sure, and likewise Hamas in its charter document, its founding document, which I recommend viewers take a look and see Hamas in their own words. What are they all about? And frankly, it's the most classic litany of anti-Semitic myths and accusations, talking about that there's a Jewish conspiracy to control world financial systems, media markets, etc.
Sounds like something we might have heard in the 1930s in Europe and Germany in particular.
These tropes have been around even previous to that, and have continued to reverberate in different times and places. Anti-Semitism can be compared to a virus, something that mutates across time and space in order to infect a society with noxious ideas by taking on the form of whatever it is that society despises most. And Hamas makes clear in their charter that they believe in those conspiracies. They want to indoctrinate their population in an ideology of hate, in anti-Semitism, and in destruction of the state of Israel. And go ahead.
I was just going to say, I'd like to shift focus.
Sure.
We're about halfway through, and turn, if we could, Sami, toward the humanitarian crisis which is occurring. Now, I'm a little bit reluctant to ask you the question, what is the Jewish opinion in Minnesota toward certain events happening in Gaza? But because we realize that, like American opinion, there's not a monolithic view of any of these events, as I understand it in talking to people in the Jewish community. Just like among Americans, there's no monolithic American view. But clearly there is a humanitarian crisis unfolding in Gaza. Does JCRC, and do you believe most American Jews and Minnesota Jews, support U.S., UN, international efforts to open the Rafah crossing in Egypt to allow humanitarian aid, food and water to reach civilians, talking about innocent civilians that are trapped in this vice between the Hamas terrorists and the Israelis?
Just to be clear, your point is exactly right. There is no monolithic viewpoint within any community on any subject. There's nuance and complexity. And JCRC doesn't claim to speak from a position of unanimity. We do aim to speak from a point of consensus. And we feel strongly, we know there's consensus views within the American Jewish community, and same holds true in Minnesota, about support for Israel. And data will show that it's roughly going to be 4 in 5 American Jews who have a strong affinity and support for Israel as part of their Jewish identity. As far as the humanitarian crisis, it's part of war to see horrific and damaging photos, video, human suffering, and that pains us as human beings. At the same time, we understand that there's a military campaign against a genocidal terrorist organization, and there's a war that needs to be fought, but it needs to be fought in a just and ethical manner, both by the rules of international law and even the rules of Jewish law. Jewish ethics have extensive teachings about the laws of war and
About not harming innocent people.
absolutely, exactly. To the extent that that can be avoided, that is critical.
So a key question for you would be, can Israel root out Hamas terrorists who are embedded in Gaza, in the Gaza population, and who are also holding Israeli and American hostages? Can they do that without killing lots of innocent civilians?
It's an excellent and very difficult question, and I believe the United States will be watching closely to ensure that Israel abides by the laws of war to which it has agreed. But it's a difficult situation when one side is fighting by those rules and the other side flouts them in the most horrific and obscene ways possible, where you have Hamas deliberately embedding themselves within the civilian population, placing their military infrastructure among schools and mosques and other civilian assets. And so Israel has every intention of keeping civilians safe in Gaza, attacking only military targets. But Hamas is not playing by those same rules. And we saw that with the utmost clarity on October 7th, where the intention was to massacre as many civilians as possible.
Obviously with no warning whatsoever. Although before the Israelis launched rocket strikes into Gaza, I understand they were asking people to move toward the south, dropping leaflets from the air, warning people it's not safe to stay here. But it seems like a terrible problem, because as we hear more reports about civilian deaths and casualties, I think we haven't seen the worst of this. It could get very, very bad, worse than it is. I want to read you a quote that I came across. Minnesota native from St. Louis Park, columnist and author Tom Friedman recently wrote in the New York Times a column where he said that the four most dangerous words when talking about the Middle East are once and for all. You may have seen the column. And his point was, he was saying, we've heard this before, that when ISIS struck the U.S. in 9/11, other terrorist attacks throughout the region and in Europe and around the world, people say, well, we're going to eliminate these organizations like Hamas once and for all. We've heard that rhetoric from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as well. Friedman writes, quote, "It would be a big mistake for Israel to occupy Gaza again." Do you agree or disagree with his thought on that?
I think the state of Israel needs to be thinking right now very clearly about what its military goals are and what happens on the day after those goals are achieved. And if the goals have been articulated as eradicating Hamas and its military capability, Steve, it's not clear to me what comes next.
No.
And frankly, there are no good options that I can see at this moment.
Because what seems to have happened, and this was Tom Friedman's point in the New York Times, I believe, was that often these groups, when you think you may have hobbled them or even gotten toward significantly reducing their numbers, you're never really able to totally eliminate them. And terrorist groups, unfortunately, reconstitute themselves and radicalize new followers. So it just seems like a horrible challenge that Israel is faced with, that the region is faced with in solving this problem.
It's true. It it does seem intractable. But I can tell you one thing: the Israeli resolve is deeper than you or I or Hamas can possibly imagine. This is a country made of people who came in as refugees, fleeing violence and decades and centuries of persecution to return home, to our homeland, to Israel. And the state of Israel exists. It's a fact, and it's not going anywhere. And for years, Palestinian terrorist groups have tried to use violence in order to, as they say, send Jews back to the places where they came from. What places are those? Poland?
Russia.
That's not real.
Yeah.
That's not looking at reality. And the world needs to look at both Israelis and Palestinians and try to understand them as they understand themselves.
The U.S. policy for some time has been to support a so-called two-state solution to the differences between Israelis and Palestinians. There are many critics, including Jewish Americans, I might add, and Israelis, who have turned out in record numbers demonstrations against Benjamin Netanyahu's government over reforms they wanted to make to the judiciary, but also their settlements policy in the West Bank, and things that they see as not contributing toward not moving toward a solution where the two sides can live in peace. Is it still possible? Is a two-state solution still possible in light of the horrific events of October 7th?
The two-state solution has felt very far away for a long time now, and I think it feels even further away at this particular moment, although, you know, sometimes it takes some kind of catastrophe, a complete reshaking of the deck in order to break a stalemate. I don't want to get into the business of predicting what might come, but I do know that the Israelis don't want to be occupying Palestinians. They have no desire to maintain an indefinite military control over either the West Bank or Gaza. That's why Israel left Gaza in 2005 in the first place. But what we experienced in the last 18 years, and in a little bit less than that since Hamas took over in 2007, is an unacceptable level of terrorism, now to the point where it's really crossed a line. And there's a lot of rhetoric out there about how the occupation begets the terrorism, that Israel is somehow getting what it deserves through this violence by nature of its actions towards the Palestinians. But the reverse is no less true, that terrorism begets occupation, because Israelis deserve security.
Everyone does.
Everyone does,
yeah.
Absolutely. And they're going to do whatever it needs to be done in order to maintain that level of security.
I've heard some people say, they've said, well, you know, the Palestinians elected Hamas, but that was 18 years ago, and there were questions about the legitimacy of that and threats against people who threaten to rise up against Hamas or challenge them. And we've seen how they deal with people who challenge their authority. That's a long time ago. So isn't it the case, in fact, that a lot of innocent Palestinian civilians, again, they are caught in the middle of this?
Absolutely. They're living under a brutal police state dictatorship and radical theocracy that is antithetical to so many of our ideals that are shared between the United States and Israel.
Sami, we're down to the last 2 minutes. I want to ask you, what is JCRC doing right now to combat this rising anti-Semitism in our community?
Well, at JCRC, we approach everything through 3 different prongs. One is education. We try to bring balanced, fair information to Jews and non-Jews alike to have a deeper understanding of the complexity of these situations, understand who Jews are and how anti-Semitism works and how we can work together to combat it. We advocate with our elected officials to do things that'll keep the Jewish community safe. And we have a robust security program as well that works with all of our synagogues and schools to do what they possibly can to maintain a safe and secure environment while also remaining warm and welcoming.
We should mention, too, that at the same time we've seen a rise in anti-Semitism, there are also reports of an increase in crimes directed against Muslim people in our community, too, and nationwide. So this seems to be a very difficult challenge for people of different faiths, not just Muslim, but other people who are involved, too.
It's a difficult time, and I think President Biden's message last night was exactly right. We are all Americans, and we should stick together, not succumb to fear, not succumb to hatred, and try as best we can to sit together, speak, understand, across difference.
And to try to see the humanity in each other again so we can get to a better day.
Absolutely. If compassion can win the day, then that's all we can pray for.
Sami Rahamim from the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, thank you for being our guest today on Access to Democracy.
Thank you, Steve.